The fog rolled across the Drelgast basin like a living shroud, thick as cathedral incense and twice as choking. It had been 3 days since the first reports came through the Vox channels, crackling with static and the distant sound of marching feet. 3 days since High Command had received word that the 77th God-Blooded had emerged from the mist, moving in perfect formation toward the forward trenches of New Antioch. Commissar Matthias Voss stood at the observation post, his fingers wrapped around a cup of recaf that had long since gone cold. The liquid inside had formed a skin of grease that caught the pale light filtering through the bunker's slit windows. Beyond the reinforced glass, the fog pressed against the fortificated walls like a breathing thing, pulsing with each gust of wind that carried the smell of old graves and rusted iron. The 77th God-Blooded. He had memorized their service record during the long journey to this Emperor-forsaken outpost. A decorated regiment of trench zealots, known for their unwavering faith and their willingness to die for the imperial creed. They had vanished during the siege of Drelgast nearly a century ago, swallowed by the fog and the chaos of that bitter campaign. Their names had been carved into the shrine of the martyrs, their deeds recorded in the annals of sacred warfare. Dead men did not march in formation. The Vox unit crackled to life, spitting static and the voice of Sergeant Kairos from the forward positions. His words were strained, filtered through layers of interference that made them sound like they were coming from the bottom of a well. Commissar, they're still coming. Same pace as yesterday, same formation. We tried hailing them again, but the transmission cut out for a moment, filled with the whisper of dead air. They don't respond, sir. They just keep marching. Voss set down his cup and moved to the Vox unit, pressing the transmit key. Describe their condition, Sergeant. Hard to make out through the fog, sir, but their armor. It's wrong. Covered in something that looks like ash, but it moves when the wind hits it. And their banners, sir. They're carrying banners, but the symbols. Another pause. Longer this time. They're not imperial, sir. Not anymore. The commissar felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had seen heresy before, had put down countless rebellions, and purged the unfaithful with bolt and blade. But this was different. This was an entire regiment, returned from the dead with their faith twisted into something unrecognizable. Behind him, Confessor Morgrim cleared his throat. The old priest stood in the corner of the bunker, his augmetic eye whirring as it adjusted its focus. Scars covered half his face, souvenirs from a lifetime of rooting out corruption in the ranks of the faithful. His voice, when he spoke, was like gravel grinding against bone. The ecclesiarchy has protocols for such things, Commissar. When the dead return bearing false witness, when the faithful are led astray by voices from beyond the veil. Voss turned to face him. And what do those protocols suggest, Confessor? Morgrim's scarred lips curved into something that might have been a smile. Purification through fire, cleansing through blade. The removal of corruption, at its source, no matter how deep the roots have grown. The Vox crackled again, and Sergeant Kairos's voice returned, more distorted than before. Sir, you need to see this. We've got movement on the secondary perimeter. They're setting up camp. Voss grabbed his coat and weapons, the familiar weight of his bolt pistol heavy against his hip. Prep a squad, Sergeant. We're moving forward. Sir, with respect, the fog is thick enough to lose a man 5 feet from his position, and those things out there. Our Imperial soldiers until proven otherwise. Voss cut him off, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Prepare the squad, Sergeant. That's an order. The connection cut out, leaving only the whisper of static and the distant sound of marching feet that seemed to echo from every direction at once. The forward trenches carved through the black soil like infected wounds, their walls reinforced with sheets of blessed metal and warded against the corruption that seeped from the earth itself. Voss moved through them with practiced ease, his boots splashing through puddles of water that reflected nothing but shadow. Behind him followed a squad of anointed troopers, their faces hidden behind rebreathers that filtered the poisoned air. The fog grew thicker as they approached the perimeter, pressing against them like wet cloth. It carried sounds that had no source, whispers in languages that predated the Imperial Creed, and the constant rhythmic thud of boots against mud that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Sergeant Kairos waited at the forward observation post, his face pale beneath his helmet. He pointed toward the no-man's land beyond the wire, where shapes moved in the mist like ghosts made manifest. There, sir. Can you see them? Voss squinted through the fog, his augmetic eye cycling through different visual spectrums. Slowly, shapes began to resolve from the gray. Figures in power armor, moving with mechanical precision through the ruined landscape. Their formations were perfect, exactly as they would have been a century ago when the 77th God-Blooded had been the pride of the Imperial war machine. But their banners were wrong. The standards they carried bore symbols that hurt to look at directly, twisting geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when observed. Where once the Imperial Aquila had spread its wings in victory, now there were shapes that suggested tentacles, eyes, and mouths filled with too many teeth. How many? Voss asked. Full company strength, sir. Maybe more. They're setting up defensive positions along the ridgeline, just like the tactical manuals teach. But, sir, Kairos hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. They're not casting shadows. Voss looked again, focusing on the ground beneath the marching figures. The sergeant was right. The fog swirled around their feet, but the pale light filtering through the mist cast no shadows where they walked. It was as if they were present, but not truly there, existing in some space between the living world and whatever lay beyond. Confessor Morgrim joined them at the observation post, his augmetic eye clicking as it recorded everything. Abominations, he muttered. The dead should not walk in the realm of the living. Their very presence is an affront to the natural order. Can we communicate with them? Voss asked. The confessor's scarred face twisted with disgust. One does not communicate with heretics, Commissar. One purges them. But Voss was already moving toward the Vox array, adjusting the frequency to the standard Imperial channels. Static filled the air, punctuated by bursts of interference that sounded almost like breathing. He pressed the transmit key and spoke into the crackling void. 77th God, Blooded. This is Commissar Voss of the Tribunal of Faith. Identify yourselves and state your intentions. The response came immediately, but it was not what he expected. A voice, dry as desert sand and hollow as an empty grave, filled the bunker. It spoke in High Gothic, but the words were arranged in patterns that made them sound like blasphemy. We are the 77th of the God, Blooded, servants of the true faith, bearers of the sacred burden. We have returned from the deep places to bring salvation to the faithful. Voss exchanged glances with Morgrim. The Confessor's augmetic eye was spinning rapidly, its lenses adjusting as it analyzed the transmission. "Identify your commanding officer," Voss continued. Another pause filled with static and the sound of something that might have been laughter. "We serve under the guidance of Colonel Thaddeus Grimm. Blessed be his name, blessed be his vision. We have walked the paths of truth and found them wanting. We have seen the face of divinity, and it is beautiful." Morgrim grabbed Voss's arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "Colonel Grimm died at Drelgast." He hissed. "I read the reports myself. His body was recovered, blessed, and interred in the sepulchre of heroes. He has been dead for 97 years. The vox crackled again, and the voice returned, closer now, as if its owner were standing just outside the bunker walls. "The dead do not die, Commissar. They merely wait. And we have waited so very long to share what we have learned." The transmission cut out, leaving them in silence broken only by the drip of condensation from the bunker's ceiling and the distant sound of marching feet that seemed to be growing closer. Dawn brought no relief from the fog, only a pale gray light that made the mist glow like phosphorescent rot. Voss led his squad deeper into the contested zone, following coordinates provided by aerial reconnaissance that had managed to penetrate the unnatural weather. The reports spoke of structures, defensive positions that had been erected during the night with impossible speed and precision. What they found defied explanation. The shrine rose from the mud like a tumor of bone and twisted metal, its walls constructed from what appeared to be human remains fused together with some kind of organic mortar. Skulls formed decorative patterns along its base, their empty sockets staring outward with expressions of eternal anguish. Above them, rib cages had been woven together to create archways, while longer bones served as structural supports for a roof made from what looked like stretched skin. The smell was overwhelming, not the clean scent of death that came from a properly consecrated battlefield, but something worse, something that spoke of corruption and decay held in perfect preservation. It clung to their rebreathers, seeping through the filters like a living thing. "Emperor's mercy," whispered Trooper Cadence, the youngest member of their squad. His voice was muffled by his rebreather, but the horror in it was unmistakable. Voss raised his hand for silence, studying the structure. The bone walls were covered in symbols carved with surgical precision, each one a mockery of imperial iconography. The Aquila had been twisted into something with too many wings, its beak replaced by a mouth full of human teeth. Sacred texts had been rewritten in a flowing script that hurt to read, the words themselves seeming to writhe and shift when observed directly. "Heretical construction," Morgrim observed, his augmetic eye recording everything, "built to pervert the faithful, to corrupt the sacred through proximity to the profane." They moved closer, weapons ready, boots squelching in the mud that seemed thicker here, more viscous. The shrine's entrance was an archway made from fused spinal columns, their vertebrae arranged in patterns that suggested movement even in their ossified state. Beyond it lay darkness that seemed to swallow light. From within came the sound of chanting. The voices were human, or had once been human. They rose and fell in harmonies that followed no musical theory Voss recognized, weaving together words in low Gothic that had been arranged into patterns that made them sound like prayers to something that was decidedly not the God Emperor. "We are the chosen of the deep places. We are the blessed of the forgotten paths. Through suffering we find truth. Through corruption we find purity. Through death we find life eternal." Voss signaled for his squad to spread out, approaching the entrance from multiple angles. The chanting continued, growing louder as they drew closer. It was hypnotic in its rhythm, each word carefully placed to create a cadence that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to something deeper. The interior of the shrine was lit by corpse candles, their flames burning with colors that should not exist in nature. Blue-green fire that cast no heat, purple tongues that seemed to lick at the air itself, and deep red blazes that pulsed in rhythm with a heartbeat that came from nowhere and everywhere. At the center of this space, kneeling figures in the remnants of imperial armor recited their blasphemous liturgy. Their faces were visible beneath their helmets, pale and drawn, with eyes that reflected the candlelight like mirrors. They did not acknowledge the intrusion, did not turn to face the armed soldiers who had entered their sacred space. They simply continued to pray. Voss stepped forward, his bolt pistol drawn but not yet aimed. By the authority of the commissariat and the ecclesiarchy, I order you to cease this heretical activity and submit to questioning. The chanting stopped. In the sudden silence, the only sound was the guttering of the corpse candles and the drip of moisture from the bone ceiling. The kneeling figures remained motionless for a long moment, their heads bowed in apparent meditation. Then, slowly, they began to turn. Their faces were human, but wrong. The features were correct, eyes and nose and mouth all in their proper places, but there was something in their expressions that spoke of experiences beyond mortal comprehension. They looked at Voss and his squad with the kind of pity reserved for children who had not yet learned the harsh truths of existence. One of them, a woman whose armor bore the insignia of a sergeant, spoke in a voice like wind through dead leaves. "You do not understand, Commissar. You see heresy where there is revelation. You see corruption where there is purification. We have been shown the truth that lies beneath the lies you call faith. The only truth is service to the God, Emperor," Voss replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. The woman smiled, and her teeth were too sharp, too numerous. "The God, Emperor, is a lie, Commissar. A fiction created to hide the real divinity that dwells in the deep places, that sleeps in the black soil beneath our feet. We have seen it, we have touched it, and it has touched us in return." Morgrim stepped forward, his augmetic eye blazing with righteous fury. "Enough blasphemy. Commissar, give the order." But before Voss could respond, the corpse candles flickered and went out, plunging the shrine into a darkness so complete it seemed solid. In that darkness, something moved, something vast and patient and hungry. And when the flames returned, the kneeling figures were gone, leaving only the echo of their laughter and the lingering scent of grave dirt and rotting flowers. The Vox recordings were discovered in an ammunition bunker that had been abandoned for decades, its blast doors sealed with rust and time. The squad found them during their systematic search of the forward positions, stored in archival canisters that bore the seal of the 77th God-Blooded. The metal was corroded, eaten away by some kind of acid that had left patterns resembling teeth marks in the steel. Voss played the first recording in the relative safety of the command bunker, the ancient Vox caster struggling to process data that seemed to fight against being heard. Static filled the air, punctuated by bursts of sound that resolved into voices speaking in reverse, their words flowing backward through time like water running uphill. Day 37 of the siege came a voice that might once have been Colonel Grimm's, though distorted by layers of interference. "The enemy positions remain. unchanged. Our attempts to advance have been unsuccessful. The men report strange dreams, visions of things that should not be. The recording degraded into static for several seconds before clearing again, revealing a different voice, younger, filled with barely contained terror. "There in the walls, sir. I can hear them scratching, clawing, trying to get out, or maybe trying to get in. The boundary is becoming unclear. The chaplain says it's just stress, just the strain of the siege, but we all know better. We all know what we've seen in the deep trenches." More static, then another voice, this one speaking in the measured tones of a field medic. "Casualty report for the 15th Company. 12 dead, cause unknown. No wounds, no signs of violence. They simply stopped. Hearts stopped beating, lungs stopped drawing breath. But sir, the strange thing is, they're still moving. Still responding to orders. They fight better dead than they ever did alive." Voss paused the recording, studying the expressions on his companions' faces. Morgrim's augmetic eye was spinning rapidly, its lenses clicking as they adjusted to focus on nothing. Sergeant Kairos had gone pale, his hands trembling as he gripped his lasgun. "How is this possible?" Kairos whispered. "Men don't fight after death. The dead don't take orders." "Play the next recording," Morgrim commanded, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. Voss complied, and the Voxcaster crackled to life again. This time the voice was definitely Colonel Grimm's, but changed, hollow, as if it were being filtered through layers of earth and stone. "Day 50. 1. The distinction between us and them is becoming academic. We have learned that death is not an ending, but a transformation. The soil beneath our feet is alive, brothers. It speaks to those who know how to listen. It offers gifts to those willing to accept them." A new voice joined the colonel's, speaking in harmonics that created unsettling resonances in the bunker's acoustics. "The god, Emperor, has abandoned us to this place, left us to die in trenches that serve no purpose but to feed the hungry earth. But we have found a new purpose, a new master. One who appreciates sacrifice, who rewards loyalty with gifts beyond mortal comprehension. The transformation is beautiful," Grimm continued, his voice now layered with others, as if multiple people were speaking through his throat. "Pain becomes pleasure, death becomes life. Service becomes slavery, becomes freedom. We understand now why we were brought to this place. Not to win a war, but to learn a truth that will reshape the galaxy." The recording shifted, and suddenly they could hear gunfire, screams, the sounds of battle being joined. But there were other sounds too, wet sliding noises, the crack of bones breaking and reforming, laughter that came from too many mouths. "The Loyalists refuse to understand," one of the voices said, "no longer identifiable as human. They cling to their false faith, their dying emperor, their lies about duty and honor. But we will teach them. We will show them the beauty of corruption, the joy of surrender. They will thank us when they see what we have become." The recording ended abruptly, cutting off in the middle of what sounded like a prayer spoken in a language that had never been meant for human throats. In the silence that followed, Voss became aware of a new sound, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from within the bunker's walls. It was soft at first, barely audible above the hum of the air recyclers, but it grew steadily louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Like fingers drumming against metal, or claws scratching at stone, or teeth chattering in endless anticipation. Morgrim was the first to move, pressing his ear against the nearest wall. His augmetic eye dilated, its sensors straining to penetrate the reinforced concrete. "There's something in the walls," he whispered. "Something moving in the spaces between spaces." The tapping stopped. In the sudden silence, they could hear their own breathing, their own heartbeats, and beneath it all, the faint sound of chanting that seemed to come from very far away and very close at the same time. The rebreather should have been filled with nothing but dust and the desiccated remains of whoever had worn it a century ago. Instead, it pulsed with a rhythm that matched the beating of a heart, its filters expanding and contracting as if drawing breath. The device sat in the center of what had once been the 77th's command post, now transformed into something that belonged in a nightmare. The walls were covered in tactical maps, but the terrain they depicted was wrong. Mountain ranges that curved like spines, rivers that flowed upward toward stars arranged in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Supply lines were marked in what appeared to be dried blood, their routes connecting locations that existed in no atlas Voss had ever seen. The rebreather spoke. "Welcome, Commissar Voss. I have been expecting you." The voice emerged from the device's speakers with the wet, bubbling quality of someone speaking through liquid. But underneath the distortion, Voss recognized the authoritative tones he had heard on the archived recordings. Colonel Thaddeus Grimm, dead for nearly a century, reduced to a voice trapped in corroded machinery. "You are not Colonel Grimm," Voss said, his bolt pistol trained on the device despite the futility of the gesture. "Colonel Grimm died at Drelgast." Laughter emerged from the rebreather, a sound like steam escaping from a ruptured pipe. "Death is such a limited concept, Commissar. I died, yes. My body failed, my heart stopped, my lungs ceased their function. But I did not end. The soil beneath Drelgast is rich with possibility, thick with the dreams of things that sleep in the deep places. It offered me continuation, and I accepted." Morgrim stepped forward, his augmetic eye focusing on the device. Blasphemous technology. The machine's spirit has been corrupted, possessed by some entity that wears the dead man's voice like a mask. "Oh, Confessor Morgrim," the rebreather said, its tone now mocking. "Still clinging to your primitive understanding of the divine. You speak of machine spirits as if they were separate from the greater consciousness that permeates all things. But we have learned better. We have seen the truth that your ecclesiarchy works so hard to hide." The tactical maps on the walls began to shift, their features rearranging themselves into new configurations. Supply lines became arteries, mountain ranges became the curves of a vast rib cage, and the rivers transformed into neural pathways connecting nodes of activity that pulsed with an alien intelligence. "This is what lies beneath your precious Imperium," Grimm's voice continued. "A living entity of such scope and complexity that your limited minds can barely comprehend its smallest appendages. It dreams, Commissar. It dreams of awakening, of rising from the black soil, where it has slumbered for eons uncounted, and we are its heralds." Voss felt something cold settle in his stomach as he studied the transformed maps. The patterns were hypnotic, drawing the eye into spirals and curves that seemed to extend infinitely inward. "What do you want?" "Want?" The rebreather pulsed faster, its breathing apparatus working overtime. We want nothing, Commissar. We simply are. We exist. We serve. But our master, the dreaming god beneath the earth, it wants something very specific. It wants to wake up. And every soul that embraces the truth, every mind that abandons the lies of the false emperor, brings it closer to consciousness. The chanting began again, drifting through the walls like smoke. Multiple voices, speaking in unison, their words creating harmonics that resonated in the bones of everyone present. Voss felt his teeth ache, his vision blur, as if something were trying to restructure his perception of reality. Listen to them, Commissar, my faithful soldiers, my devoted servants. They have learned to sing the awakening song, to add their voices to the chorus that will eventually rouse our master from its slumber. You could join them. You could know the joy of true service, the ecstasy of genuine faith. The only faith is service to the god, Emperor, Voss repeated, but the words felt hollow in his mouth, empty of conviction. The god, Emperor. Grimm's voice took on a tone of infinite sadness. A corpse on a throne, Commissar. A desiccated husk feeding on the psychic energy of 1,000,000 souls daily just to maintain the illusion of life. Is that truly the divinity you would serve? A dead thing that demands endless sacrifice for the promise of salvation it can never deliver? The maps continued to shift, and now Voss could see new details emerging from their evolving patterns. Cities built in the spaces between spaces, populated by figures that moved with purposes beyond human understanding. Vast machines that functioned according to principles that violated the laws of physics. And at the center of it all, something immense and patient, waiting for the moment when enough voices joined the chorus to sing it awake. Show them, Grimm commanded, and the walls themselves began to change. The reinforced concrete rippled like water, revealing glimpses of what lay beyond. Not the familiar landscape of the Drelgast Basin, but something else entirely. A realm of endless twilight, where the sky was the color of old blood and the ground was composed of millions of sleeping faces. In the distance, structures rose that defied architectural logic, their geometries designed to please senses that humans did not possess. This is where we truly live now, Grimm explained, his voice filled with something that might have been nostalgia. Not in your limited physical realm, but in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats. We are more than we ever were in life, Commissar. We are servants of truth rather than slaves to lies. The vision faded, the walls returning to their mundane concrete composition, but the impression remained, burned into Voss's retinas, like the afterimage of staring too long at a bright light. He could still see those sleeping faces, still hear the whisper of voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. You cannot stop what is coming, Grimm's voice said, growing fainter as the rebreather's power source began to fail. The awakening has begun. More voices join the chorus every day, every hour, every moment. Your precious Imperium will crumble, your false emperor will fall, and from the ruins will rise something beautiful and terrible and true. The device went silent, its breathing apparatus finally ceasing its rhythmic pulsing. But in the quiet that followed, Voss could still hear the chanting, closer now, as if the singers were standing just outside the command post's walls. Waiting, always waiting. The phenomenon became impossible to ignore as they pressed deeper into the fog-shrouded territory held by the 77th. Every member of the regiment they encountered cast no shadow, moved through the world as if they existed in some space adjacent to reality. But it was worse than simple absence. Where their shadows should have fallen, something else took their place. Voss first noticed it during their approach to what had once been Firebase Meridian, now transformed into a sprawling complex of bone and corroded metal that served as the regiment's forward command post. The pale light filtering through the fog should have created clear shadows on the ground, but instead, the earth beneath the walking figures writhed with shapes that belonged to no human form. Tentacles where there should have been legs, clusters of eyes where a torso should cast its silhouette, mouths filled with rows of teeth that opened and closed in patterns that seemed to mock the rhythm of breathing. The shadows moved independently of their supposed owners, reaching toward observers with appendages that existed only in the spaces between light and darkness. "Do you see it?" Sergeant Kairos whispered, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. He was pointing at a group of soldiers from the 77th who were constructing some kind of altar from the bones of what might once have been a Lehman Russ tank. The metal had been twisted into organic curves, fused with human remains in ways that created a structure that was simultaneously mechanical and biological. The soldiers worked with mechanical precision, their movements coordinated in ways that suggested they were following orders transmitted through means other than verbal communication. But on the ground beneath them, their shadows writhed and coiled like living things, reaching toward each other with appendages that connected them in a network of dark communion. "Warp," touched, Morgrim muttered, his augmetic eye clicking as it tried to focus on phenomena that existed only partially in the visible spectrum. Their souls have been altered, restructured according to principles that violate the natural order. They watched as one of the soldiers lifted a human skull, positioning it atop the altar with ceremonial care. The bone was covered in carved symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly, creating patterns that drew the eye into spirals of meaning that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to something deeper, more primitive. As the skull was placed, the shadows beneath all the soldiers pulsed in unison, their dark forms reaching upward like supplicants offering prayer to an unseen deity. The motion was synchronized, purposeful, as if the shadows were the true beings and the physical forms above them merely puppets dancing to their will. "We need to move closer," Voss decided, though every instinct screamed against the idea. "We need to understand what they're doing, what purpose these alterations serve." They crept forward through the ruins of what had once been a supply depot, using the twisted wreckage for cover. The fog helped conceal their approach, but it also seemed to carry their presence to the enemy in ways that conventional surveillance could not. More than once, Voss saw members of the 77th pause in their work, their heads turning toward hidden observers with the precision of mechanical tracking systems. The altar was nearly complete now, its structure rising from the muddy ground like a malignant growth. Human skulls formed decorative patterns along its base, while longer, bones had been woven together to create archways that framed empty spaces filled with darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than simply reflecting its absence. But it was the shadows that commanded attention. As the physical altar grew, the dark forms beneath the workers became more complex, more detailed. What had begun as simple tentacles and eyes evolved into recognizable patterns, geometric shapes that suggested vast intelligence operating according to principles beyond human understanding. The shapes were writing something. The realization hit Voss like a physical blow. The shadows were not random manifestations of otherworldly influence. They were components of a message, letters in an alphabet designed to communicate concepts that human language could not express. Each soldier's shadow contributed to the greater text, their movements adding lines and curves to an ever-evolving document written in darkness itself. "What does it say?" Kairos asked, his voice barely audible above the wind that carried the constant sound of marching feet and distant chanting. Morgrim was the first to respond, his augmetic eye spinning rapidly as it analyzed the patterns. I can read portions of it. The symbols are similar to texts recovered from pre-imperial ruins, languages that predate human civilization. But this is different, more complex, more complete. The confessor's scarred face had gone pale, his usual expression of righteous anger replaced by something approaching awe. "It's a prayer," he whispered. "A request for guidance addressed to something that dwells beneath the material realm. But not just any request. This is an invocation, a calling, a summoning." As if responding to his words, the shadows began to move faster, their writing becoming more urgent, more detailed. New symbols appeared, growing from the darkness, like flowers blooming in reverse, their meanings cascading through the observers' minds, whether they wanted to understand or not. The altar was finished. The soldiers of the 77th stepped back from their work, their movements perfectly synchronized despite the absence of any visible coordination. They formed a circle around the structure, their heads bowed in apparent meditation, and beneath them, their shadows reached toward the center, toward the empty space that the altar framed, as if offering themselves to whatever might choose to fill that void. The chanting began again, louder now, voices joining together in harmonies that created resonances in the very air itself. The fog swirled faster, forming patterns that echoed the symbols written in shadow, and the pale light filtering through the mist began to take on colors that should not exist in nature. Something was coming. Something vast and patient and hungry, drawn by the prayers of the faithful and the promises written in darkness. Voss could feel its approach like pressure in his ears, like the taste of copper on his tongue, like the touch of cold fingers against the back of his neck. The shadows beneath the soldiers began to rise, lifting from the ground like smoke given form and purpose. They reached toward the sky, toward the swirling patterns in the fog, toward something that existed in the spaces between spaces and was finally beginning to stir. The recording chamber had been constructed from the remnants of a rhino transport, its armored hull split open like a metallic flower to reveal an interior lined with human skin. The hide had been preserved through some process that left it supple and responsive, covered in symbols that seemed to have been carved from the inside, pushing through the dermis to create raised patterns that pulsed with their own internal rhythm. Inside the chamber, a figure sat hunched over a Vox transmission array that had been extensively modified with components of obviously heretical origin. Tubes of what appeared to be living tissue connected the machine to the operator, penetrating the skin at the base of the skull and disappearing into neural pathways that had been surgically altered to accommodate the interface. The figure looked up as Voss and his team approached, revealing a face that had once been human but now showed signs of extensive modification. Additional eyes had been grafted along the temples, their pupils dilated to accommodate spectrums of light that natural human vision could not process. The mouth had been widened, fitted with additional rows of teeth that created a perpetual expression of predatory hunger. "Commissar Voss," the figure said, its voice emerging from speakers embedded in its throat. "We have been broadcasting specifically for your benefit. Have you been listening?" Voss realized with growing horror that he had been listening. Throughout their journey into the heart of the 77th territory, his Vox unit had been picking up transmissions, fragments of conversation and prayer that he had dismissed as interference or enemy chatter. But now, with the source before him, he understood that every word had been carefully chosen, specifically targeted to reach his ears. "What are you?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. The figure smiled, its multiple rows of teeth gleaming in the light of the corpse candles that provided illumination for the chamber. "I am Communication Specialist Valdris of the 77th God, Blooded, 7th Company, 3rd Platoon. Though I admit that designations become somewhat meaningless after one has embraced the flesh gospel and learned to speak with the voice of divinity itself." The skin lining the chamber pulsed faster, its raised symbols shifting and rearranging themselves into new patterns. Voss realized that the entire structure was alive, a massive organism that had grown around the technological components to create something that was simultaneously organic and mechanical. "The flesh gospel teaches us that separation is illusion," Valdris continued, gesturing toward the walls with hands that had been modified to include additional joints and fingers. "Your Imperium preaches division, man from machine, flesh from spirit, life from death. But we have learned that all boundaries are false, all distinctions are lies told by those who fear the truth of unity." The tubes connecting the operator to the transmission array pulsed with fluid that moved in colors Voss had no names for. Each pulse sent ripples through the skin walls, creating waves of symbols that flowed from one end of the chamber to the other in patterns that suggested meaning beyond human comprehension. "Listen," Valdris commanded, and the transmission array crackled to life. The broadcast that emerged from the speakers was not the reverse litany they had heard before, but something worse. It was a sermon, delivered in the measured tones of imperial doctrine but twisted into shapes that violated every principle of faith Voss had ever held. The voice was Colonel Grimm's, but layered with harmonics that suggested multiple speakers occupying the same throat. "Brothers and sisters of the false faith, children of the dying emperor, servants of lies and keepers of illusions, the time of awakening approaches. The sleeper stirs in the deep places, and its dreams begin to reshape the waking world. You have felt it in your prayers, in the moments when your words ring hollow and your devotions taste like ash. You have seen it in your dreams, in the visions that come when you close your eyes and try to find peace in darkness." Voss felt something cold spreading through his chest as the words continued, because he had felt it. In the quiet moments between battles, when exhaustion overcame vigilance and his mind wandered into territories it should not explore, he had tasted ash in his prayers, had felt the hollowness in words that had once carried the weight of absolute conviction. "The God, Emperor, is a lie," Grimm's voice continued, each word precisely placed to create maximum psychological impact. A corpse that consumes the souls of humanity while offering nothing in return but empty promises and endless suffering. But beneath the black soil, beneath the foundations of your crumbling cities, something real waits. Something that offers not promises, but gifts. Not salvation, but transformation. The sermon continued, each phrase carefully crafted to exploit the doubts that existed in every faithful heart. Voss found his attention fragmenting, part of his consciousness rebelling against the blasphemy while another part, a deeper and more honest part, acknowledged the uncomfortable truth in the heretical words. Around him, his squad was showing similar signs of internal conflict. Sergeant Kairos had gone pale, his hands trembling as he gripped his lascan. Trooper Cadence was backing toward the entrance, his breathing shallow and rapid. Even Confessor Morgrim seemed affected, his augmetic eye spinning wildly as it tried to process information that violated his fundamental understanding of reality. But it was the walls that showed the true effect of the broadcast. The skin covering the chamber had begun to writhe, its surface rippling with patterns that matched the rhythm of Grimm's words. New symbols were appearing, carved from within by forces that operated according to principles beyond material science. And with each new marking, Voss felt something shift in his own perception, as if the boundaries of his identity were being gently but persistently eroded. "You feel it now," Valdres observed, his modified features displaying what might have been compassion, the recognition, the understanding that everything you have believed, everything you have fought for, everything you have killed for, has been in service to a fiction. It is a painful realization, but pain is the price of truth. The broadcast reached its crescendo, Grimm's voice rising to fill the chamber with promises of transformation and threats of consequences for those who refuse to embrace the awakening. But beneath the words, Voss could hear something else. Other voices, thousands of them, all speaking in unison, all adding their words to the growing chorus that sought to rouse the sleeper from its dreams. "How many?" Voss managed to ask, his voice barely audible above the cacophony. Valdres smiled, his multiple rows of teeth gleaming. "More every day, Commissar. More every hour. The truth spreads like a virus, like a revelation, like a blessing. Your soldiers hear our broadcasts and begin to question. Your civilians dream our dreams and wake with new understanding. Your priests recite their prayers and taste the ash of lies upon their tongues." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the chamber in relative silence, broken only by the pulse of fluid through the organic tubes and the whisper of air moving through spaces that should not exist. But the effect lingered, hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that would never be completely extinguished. Voss realized that he was no longer entirely certain why he had come to this place, why he had been so concerned about the return of the 77th God-blooded. The justifications that had driven him seemed distant now, abstract concepts that belonged to someone he had been before entering this chamber, before hearing the flesh gospel, before understanding the true nature of the choice that faced humanity. "The awakening cannot be stopped," Valdres said, reading the conflict in the Commissar's expression. "It has already begun. The only question now is whether you will participate willingly or be transformed despite your resistance. Either way, you will serve. Either way, you will add your voice to the chorus. Either way, you will help sing our master awake." The skin walls pulsed one final time, and new symbols appeared, spelling out words in languages that predated human civilization but somehow remained perfectly comprehensible to those who looked upon them. They spoke of unity and transformation, of the dissolution of boundaries and the end of illusion. They promised peace through surrender and truth through corruption. And despite everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, everything he had sworn to defend, Voss found himself beginning to understand why someone might find such promises attractive. The tribunal convened in what had once been the Chapel of Sacred Martyrs, its vaulted ceiling now open to a sky that showed stars arranged in patterns that defied astronomical observation. The constellation overhead formed shapes that hurt to contemplate directly, geometric forms that suggested vast intelligence operating according to principles that transcended human understanding. Voss stood before an altar that had been constructed from the bones of saints, their remains fused together with some organic compound that kept them preserved while allowing them to retain a terrible semblance of life. The skulls moved occasionally, their jawbones opening and closing in silent recitation of prayers to deities whose names had been carved from human memory. Around him, the surviving members of his squad knelt in positions of apparent meditation, their heads bowed and their weapons set aside. They had not been forced into submission, had not been coerced or threatened. They had simply reached the same conclusion he was approaching, the understanding that resistance was not only futile, but fundamentally misguided. The 77th god-blood had filled the chapel, their forms more obviously inhuman now that concealment was no longer necessary. Faces had been rebuilt according to aesthetic principles that pleased senses humans did not possess. Limbs had been extended or multiplied to serve functions that transcended the limitations of baseline anatomy. Eyes had been relocated and modified to perceive spectrums of reality that existed beyond the material realm. But they were still recognizably the soldiers they had once been, still organized according to military hierarchy, still responsive to the commands of their officers. The transformation had not destroyed their identity but rather expanded it, adding new dimensions to their existence while preserving the core elements that had made them effective servants of a greater cause. Colonel Grimm emerged from the shadows at the far end of the chapel, his form so extensively modified that only the basic human outline remained recognizable. His rebreather had been integrated directly into his respiratory system, its mechanical components fused with organic tissue to create something that was simultaneously artificial and alive. When he spoke, his voice emerged from multiple sources, a choir of speakers that had been implanted throughout his restructured anatomy. Commissar Voss, you have seen the truth of our transformation, witnessed the reality of our awakening. What is your judgment? The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than mockery or threat. Grimm seemed genuinely interested in Voss's assessment, as if the opinion of an unmodified human still carried weight in whatever hierarchy governed the transformed regiment. Voss looked around the chapel, studying the faces of beings who had once been Imperial soldiers. He saw no madness in their expressions, no signs of corruption or decay. Instead, he saw something that might have been contentment, a sense of purpose and belonging that he had rarely encountered among the faithful of the Imperium. You are no longer human, he said finally. Grimm nodded, the gesture creating harmonics in the air as his multiple voice boxes operated in coordination. Humanity is a larval stage, Commissar. A temporary condition that serves as preparation for something greater. We have metamorphosed, evolved beyond the limitations that once constrained us. We are more than we were, better than we were, truer to our ultimate purpose than we ever managed to be while trapped in unmodified flesh. The altar before them began to pulse with light that emanated from within the fused bones, creating patterns that matched the rhythm of a heartbeat that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The illumination revealed new details in the chapel's architecture, showed that the walls themselves were alive, covered in a skin that bore tattooed prayers in languages that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the genetic memory encoded in human DNA. "What do you want from me?" Voss asked. "Nothing," Grimm replied, his tone suggesting genuine surprise at the question. "We want nothing from you, Commissar. We simply want you to understand, to witness, to choose. The awakening is not a conquest, but an invitation. Those who accept it willingly undergo the most complete transformation, become the most perfect servants of the dreaming God. But even those who resist eventually contribute to the greater purpose." The bones in the altar shifted, rearranging themselves into new configurations that spelled out messages in alphabets composed of human remains. The words were visible for only moments before dissolving and reforming into new shapes, new meanings, new promises of transformation and unity. "Your resistance has served its purpose," Grimm continued. "Every question you have asked, every doubt you have expressed, every moment of horror you have experienced, all of it has been necessary. The dreaming God learns through opposition, grows stronger through conflict, becomes more complete through the integration of perspectives that initially reject its influence." Voss felt something shift in his understanding, a realization that crystallized with the weight of absolute certainty. "You wanted me to come here. You wanted the Imperium to send investigators." "Of course," Grimm confirmed. "How else would our transformation be complete? We needed witnesses, needed judges, needed representatives of the old faith to observe what we have become and carry that knowledge back to their masters. Every report you file, every testimony you give, every warning you issue will serve to spread awareness of what awaits. And awareness is the first step toward acceptance." The congregation of transformed soldiers began to chant, their voices joining together in harmonies that created resonances in the chapel's living walls. The sound was hypnotic, beautiful in ways that transcended conventional aesthetics, and Voss found himself listening with an attention that bordered on worship. "The choice is yours, Commissar," Grimm said, his multiple voices creating complex musical patterns as he spoke. "You can return to your superiors, file your reports, issue your warnings. You can marshal the forces of the Imperium against us, bring armies to this place, turn the sky black with the smoke of orbital bombardment. It will not matter. The awakening has begun, and it cannot be stopped by conventional weapons or traditional faith." The chanting grew louder, and now Voss could make out individual words. Phrases that described realities beyond human experience and promised access to forms of existence that transcended the limitations of unmodified consciousness. The meaning flowed through him like liquid light, bypassing his rational mind and speaking directly to something deeper, more primitive, more honest about its desires and fears. "Or," Grimm continued, "you can choose transformation willingly. You can join us, become part of something greater than the sum of its components. Add your voice to the chorus that sings our master toward wakefulness. The choice is yours, and it will be respected regardless of what you decide." Voss closed his eyes, trying to shut out the hypnotic beauty of the chanting, trying to remember why he had once found the sight of these transformed beings so horrifying. But the memories seemed distant now, belonging to someone he had been before entering this place, before learning the truth about the dreaming god and the limits of human potential. When he opened his eyes again, he found that his hand was resting on the altar, his palm pressed against the fused bones of saints whose names had been forgotten by history, but whose essence remained preserved in the organic matrix that bound them together. The bones were warm to the touch, pulsing with a life that existed outside the conventional definitions of biological activity. "I need time," he said finally. Grimm nodded, his expression suggesting understanding rather than disappointment. "Time is what we have, Commissar. The dreaming god has waited eons for awakening. It can wait a little longer for your decision. But remember, every moment you delay is a moment when others make their choices, when the chorus grows stronger, when the sleeper stirs closer to consciousness." The chanting reached a crescendo, and the chapel filled with light that had no source, illumination that seemed to emerge from the very air itself. In that radiance, Voss could see glimpses of what lay beyond the material realm, hints of the reality that the transformed soldiers served, and the consciousness that dreamed in the deep places beneath the black soil. It was beautiful. It was terrible. It was inevitable. And as the light faded and the chanting subsided, Voss realized that he was no longer entirely certain which side of this conflict he was supposed to be fighting for. The tribunal was adjourned without resolution. Its purpose served not through judgment but through revelation. The truth had been witnessed, the transformation had been observed, and the choice had been offered. What remained was the waiting, the slow passage of time that would eventually bring all consciousness into alignment with the dreaming god's will. Voss walked from the chapel into a dawn that painted the sky in colors that should not exist, his shadow falling behind him in shapes that belonged to no human form. And in that shadow, something moved, something patient and hungry and filled with terrible purpose, following him back toward the world of the unawakened with promises of transformation whispered in languages that predated human speech. The fog closed around him like a living thing, and in its depths, voices sang lullabies to a god that was learning, slowly but inevitably, to wake.